Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening. Let us know in the chat where you're joining us from today. I know we have people from all over the world, and we're super excited to have Chloe and Edmond with us today to talk us through some of the essential historical context and genealogy tips and tricks for tracing your ancestors back to Sze Yap, also called Sze, which are four counties in Jiangmen in China that many, many overseas Chinese come from, especially those of us in North America. If you're not sure if you have any ancestry from Sze Yap, that's totally okay. We will be diving into a lot of different resources that can still help your search no matter where you're from. Yeah, so just to introduce, Edmond is joining us here from Toronto. He is a second generation Taishanese Canadian and the head of the Taishanese Sze Yap community here on Discord. And so that's one of our partner servers. If you're interested in learning more about your language and culture, I'm going to drop a link in the chat where you can join to explore more. And then Chloe as well is going to be co-presenting. She's the product manager at My China Roots and has done amazing work with designing the database we have online with a lot of records, making them searchable for all of us. And so Chloe's joining us from the UK and has roots in Malaysia, China, France, and is British. So yes, very much a global citizen. Okay, cool. Edmond and Chloe, thank you for leading us through today.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edmond. Let's answer the question, what and where is Sze Yap or Taishan? So let's first get started with, of what importance is genealogy? So I assume that the majority of viewers here today are living overseas, many of second generation or greater. As the overseas Chinese community, I often believe that we are often the weakest link between our future families here in the West and our ancestral family history, especially when considering the fact that the future generations may have less resources to work with, let alone the impact of the language barrier. This is why I'd recommend that you try to gather as much information as possible from your parents, grandparents, family members before it is lost to time. And in doing so, you will have a better understanding of the local culture from where your family originates from. So let's now answer the question, what and where is Taishan and Sze Yap? Sze Yap is a region consisting of 4 counties located west of Hong Kong and Macau on the mainland. The 4 counties in question are Taishan, Kaiping, Xinhui, and Enping in Mandarin. However, because the lingua franca of the province is Cantonese and the local language is Taishanese, people may often refer to these 4 counties in Cantonese or Taishanese. So you would have them as Hoisan, Hoipen, Xinhui, Yinpen, and Hoisan, Hoipen, Lhinvoi, and Yinpen. A little more recently in Sze Yap history, there was also an additional county added by the name of Hoisan or Hoisan. So just keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. A large proportion of the earlier Chinese immigrants that came to North America are from this region. Why, you may ask? Well, to understand why so many people left, we need to look at the history. And I'll pass it over to Chloe.
Thanks, Edmond. Yeah, so we thought in order to take you through some of the key events that would have pushed people out of Sze Yap, we take a real-life Sze Yap family's experience. So meet Raymond. He is 6th-generation American Chinese and a good friend of ours at My China Roots. Since the 1500s, his family has been living in a small village called Longgangli, which is in Hoipen County.
This time period coincides with the founding of Xinyang County, or Lhinnan, which would later be renamed as Taishan or Hoisan. Fast forward to the early 1800s, Taishan wasn't exactly a welcoming place. It had fierce weather, unfavorable living conditions due to the mountainous terrain, lack of water transportation prevented it from ever developing along with port cities such as Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Macau, and with the population increase led to some Taishanese leaving for Southeast Asia, where they founded the first Taishanese benevolent associations. I've personally noticed that to this day, some people from Singapore and Malaysia still say that they speak Hua instead of Hua.
And it would have been around this time that Raymond's great-great-great-grandfather grew up in the Hoipen area. So he would have heard of some cousins and relatives who had started already moving to Southeast Asia. But increasingly, he would also have heard of another place called Old Gold Mountain, or the Chinese name for San Francisco. And so he was the first of Raymond's family. He was the first of 5 generations of Raymond's family to leave Hoipen. And at the time, he left behind his son, Raymond's great-great-grandfather.
Imagine yourself in this time period. Say you were born in 1850. Over the next 60 years of your life, you would experience 14 floods, 7 typhoons, 4 earthquakes, 2 droughts, 4 epidemics, and 5 famines.
Yeah, it truly was a crazy time to be alive. And not only that, but you had all of these rebellions going on. You had the Red Turban Rebellion and the infamous Hakka Punti Wars. So as for how this affected Raymond's great-great-grandfather, well, the Hakka refugees arrived right on his doorstep in Hoipen. Although it's unclear if their family took part in the fighting, what's sure is that hundreds of thousands were left dead throughout the Hoipen area. And by 1865, Raymond's great-great-grandfather decided to follow in his father's footsteps to go and work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Shortly after would come the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was in this context that Raymond's great-grandfather also decided to follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps. Now, over the 20 years after he left, there would continue to be failed attempts to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Now, the last one took place in 1911 in Guangzhou, which was very, very close to the Sze Yap area.
So despite the founding of China's republic in 1911, fighting continued throughout China. Zuihao, Lhinvoi, Tekham, Tongsen were all major battlefields during this time. And for the next 2 decades after the founding, there were reports of over 100 murders, over 1,000 abductions, and about 7 major robberies. Between 1912 and 1926, 8 schools were attacked, leading to the abduction of over 100 pupils and teachers. Between 1900 and 1931, 1,800 multi-story watchtowers in Kaiping, also known as Hoipen, were constructed for defense purposes.
So it all became a bit too much by 1927 when the Chinese Civil War erupted between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party, followed by a typhoon in 1929. So Raymond's grandfather decided he wouldn't wait any longer and immediately called for his 10-year-old son, Raymond's father, to also be brought to the US as a paper son. Now, although the men of Raymond's family were able to escape and Raymond himself was born in the US, his grandmother remained in Hoipen, and she also lived through some fascinating but also incredibly difficult times throughout the war against the Japanese and the Communist Revolution of 1949.
So in conclusion, the history of the Taishanese had many, many conflicts. However, with the initiative of those who went overseas, they were able to accomplish many things, such as contributing to the construction of more than 1,200 schools in Taishan, the creation of the Sanning Railway Company, and the forming of some of the first overseas Chinese communities.
So we'd love to know, out of all of the participants, all of you folks joining us today, where did your family settle after leaving Sze Yap or southern China? Let us know in the text chat, or you can also unmute yourself to tell us. Okay, we've got some representation in San Francisco. Awesome.
Like coast to coast, New York, probably Seattle.
Yes.
Caribbean.
Cuba. Yes.
Accra in Jamaica.
Very cool.
Oh, nice. Wow, super international.
So you can really see why Sze Yap is known as the first ancestral hometown of overseas Chinese around the world. It is one of the oldest areas where overseas Chinese people came from. So just a few stats for you. I mean, it's If you take only the county of Hoisan or Taishan, so there are more people of Taishanese ancestry living outside of Taishan than there are in Taishan today, which really reflects that long history of immigration. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. Now that we've looked a bit at the history of the area, we're going to give you some tips on how to actually get started in tracing your Sze Yap ancestors. So all searches begin really with two steps. The first one is gathering clues, in particular names of ancestors, and secondly, gathering the address of your village back in China. So where exactly did your ancestors come from? And finally, you have visiting your village. When it comes to names, the most important thing is definitely identifying your family's names in Chinese characters. This is for several reasons. First and foremost, because surnames are of particular cultural importance in China. So when you know your Chinese surname, you know which clan you belong to. And each clan has its own unique history and legends even. So even if you don't know very much about where your family was from, if you know your Chinese surname and you're a bit savvy and you're able to Google some stuff in Chinese, you'll be able to find some really interesting ancient history about your surnames. And Edmond will explain shortly why it's so important to find the original names in Chinese.
So when looking at a Romanized name, you'll have to consider the following. Chinese characters have different pronunciations depending on the variety of Chinese you speak. This also applies to Chinese surnames. There's also the issue of language changing over time, so modern varieties will differ from the historical varieties. So for an example of how pronunciations differ depending on the variety, take a look at this image here. So in Mandarin, you might have this pronounced as qian, but in Cantonese, you would have it pronounced as qin, and in Taishanese as ten. So you can hear that it varies from language to language. To make matters more complicated, the way our ancestors had their names spelled in English was often based on how the immigration officers at the time happened to hear it. This has led to many spellings of the same surnames and other confusions. So, if you're looking through your family records and discover an anglicized name, you may need to reverse engineer it and break it down in order to find the original Chinese character. Take the surname Sito or Soho, for example, or Suhu. If you came across Sito, you can see that it's still similar to the Cantonese romanization, Sito. If you came across Suhu or Soho, you can tell that the vowels still match up with the Taishanese pronunciation, Shuhu. Another example would be the name Chin Gi He. You can see that it's most likely tied to the Taishanese pronunciation of Qin Gi He, opposed to the Cantonese or Mandarin. Note that the vowel change with some varieties of Taishanese would actually pronounce it as Tin Gei Hei instead of Gi He. So there's a lot of things to look out for when looking at these names. Finding the Chinese character is important because you will need it when you compare the name to records in China. Not to mention that many surnames are also tied to townships and villages across Sze Yap. So for example, a certain village might only have Fongs over there. So you can use that to narrow your search later on.
Now, my China roots, if you don't know how to write your surname in Chinese, we have this handy tool that lets you also reverse engineer your surname and find the Chinese equivalent. So let's say your surname is Dere, deer, and you type it into our database. Now you'd find that there would only be one match, and that would show you the Chinese character for xie in Mandarin. How would you pronounce this in Hoisan Wa, Edmond?
Dia in Taishanese, or perhaps also as De. On the Taishanese server, we have a Taishanese dictionary bot that can search up pronunciations. So if you ever need the pronunciation of a Chinese character, you can always search it up like this.
So you can see there are loads of these tools at your disposal. And just one last point on what Edmond mentioned before, how certain villages are tied to specific surnames. We've started mapping on our village database on mychinaroots.com, where possible, which villages are tied with which surname. So you could filter, for example, all Qin villages in Toisan if you wanted. This is still a work in progress, but in theory, this is also to help you narrow down the place that your ancestors might be from. Okay, so we've just been talking about surnames, but what of first names? There are many different resources available to you, and these will really depend on where your ancestors migrated to. So the first step should really be at home. Do you or your family have any personal letters, notes, photographs, anything that might have Chinese characters? Once you've exhausted this route, you could explore online resources such as Family Search or various types of immigration records. As we have many people joining us from Canada and the US, all of these countries that restricted Chinese immigration would have produced a lot of documentation for your ancestors. So the example to the left here is a typical CI9 immigration record, which was generated for any Chinese immigrant who would have had to enter through, in this case, Vancouver. The Chinese were subjected to a head tax. And you can see at the bottom that this person has signed their name in Chinese characters, which is incredibly valuable. You want the first name to compare with records back in China. Now, another great resource is Chinese family associations or place associations. For example, the Sze Yap Society in Melbourne built a phenomenal temple, which is still standing today, the Sze Yap Temple, still in Melbourne, in 1856. And inside you can find over 11,000 spirit tablets of Sze Yap members who passed away. So these ancestral tablets are meant to represent the spirit of the deceased. And this was one that one of our customers found through their search. They went in with a pair of binoculars and they were able to see in the distance a tablet that matched their ancestor's name. And these tablets usually would show the name of the person as well as their hometown or their home county. In this example, right next to the arrow, it says Xinhui, to be read from right to left. Another great resource that we always recommend people look for are tombstones. And this is because traditional Chinese tombstones are much, much more detailed than any tombstones you would find in other Western cultures. So, for example, you would be able to see a person's full name, sometimes their multiple alternative names, their birth dates, death dates, and the specific village that they came from. So we were very excited at My China Roots to release our tombstone database just about 2 months ago, which currently has a couple cemeteries from California and Singapore. So yeah, we'd love for you to check it out and let us know what you think of it. Moving on now to the step 2 of the search. We've been talking so far only about how to search for names of your ancestors and why that's important. But the second, possibly biggest challenge is figuring out the village that they came from. So why is finding your village so important? As opposed to the West, where you could find all kinds of records about your ancestors online, whether it's newspapers or birth certificates or passenger lists, you don't have any kind of centralized archive in China where you can just type in a name and get results. The reason that villages are so important is that they are the most likely place where you will find records of your family and relatives and other landmarks relating to your ancestral history. And another reason why villages are at the heart of Chinese society is because for centuries, China was basically an agrarian society, meaning the majority of the population was peasant. It was very typical for many generations in a row to live on the same land, to toil the same land over hundreds of years. So over the years, it is natural that they would accumulate landmarks and records that celebrate their history in the area. So you might be wondering, okay, what can I actually find in my village? The first thing you could find really is clan relatives or people who share your surname. When I grew up, I was always told that there was a Yap village back in China where everybody looked like us. And I thought it was a joke, but it is to a certain extent true. We've had many cases where we would go back and find a distant relative who was still living in the house that belonged to a Sze Yap family who had left, and this relative was left in charge of the house. They were told, oh, we'll be back in 10 years, but of course the family never returned. So if you're lucky, you'll still find some stories through these people, through their living memories. In addition to relatives, you could also find an ancestral house. This particular one was photographed earlier this year during one of our field trips in Hoipen County. It's absolutely beautiful. It's built in this traditional dialo style that you find a lot in the area. And this particular family had built several of these buildings inside the village. Now, inside these houses, you could also find different types of relics of your family, whether it's portraits or photographs. We've had some amazing stories of customers who go back on a roots trip and they see their parents' graduation pictures in their ancestral home, which had been sent from abroad back to China. And it gives you this just amazing sense of just, time stopping in these places that have been very well preserved. Another thing that you could find is an ancestral temple. So what is an ancestral temple? Families that were well established in villages typically would have erected temples to honor their clan. So you could find a temple that was named after the first Suhu ancestor who arrived in the area. And these serve as places of worship, but also as community centers during Chinese New Year, or just, community centers for the older folk. Inside these temples, you could find inscriptions about the history of the family living in the area, donations list of people who have perhaps donated money to the building or the renovation of the temple. Here you have ancestral portraits from Raymond, who we met earlier in the workshop. So these are from his temple, and his generation poem. The generation poem is sort of like a guideline for how to name the members of your family. So each generation has a designated character that must be included in the name. So what else can you find in your village? You can also find tombstones. So these would be found in a graveyard that is kept quite close to the main village, sometimes accessible after a short hike. And the other thing that you can find in your village, of course, is your zupu. We call this the holy grail of Chinese family history. Traditionally, each clan or each surname group inside a village would have their own zupu. You could find thousands of different zupus for the same surname, but in different areas, because each family would want to keep and preserve their own history. And these books would contain family trees, but also ancestral legends. So how did the surname first come about? As well as migration histories. How did the clan arrive in Sze Yap in the first place? Where were they before and why did they leave? If you are able to travel to your village, you should definitely ask to see if they still have a copy and see if you can find your ancestor's name inside. If you are able to find your ancestor's name, then you could potentially trace back your tree all the way to the first person who ever had your surname. And another nice thing to do is to ask if your ancestor is not included in the book. You could ask the relatives to update the book on your behalf. Now, unfortunately, it looks like with the current restrictions in place, we won't be able to travel to China anytime soon. But in the meantime, and if you want to take a shortcut, you could try out the My China Roots Zupu database, where you can filter all of our available zupus, which we have digitized and that are searchable by keyword. So long as you have an ancestor's name in Chinese, you could search for their name throughout our collection and see if we have a book that matches your family.
So let's open the floor up now for the question, where are you from in Sze Yap? Or where is your family from in Sze Yap?
Feel free to type in the chat. What have you heard from your family, or what do you know already, or have guesses?
So we have one here from Taishan. We have one here from Hoisan.
We'd also love to know if you know where in Hoisan or any of the other counties your family is from. Do you guys know your village?
I see some villages here. Long Kai Tun. Another one from Hoisan. A few from the regions outside, like Shenzhen as well. They used to have villages in Shenzhen and Hong Kong as well. Not as much now. Lambatzin. Oh, another one from Toisan. Yeah, that's nice. It's good to have people coming from all around. So, finding your village. The four counties can be broken down further into townships. So, as from the discussion before, Lambat is an example of a smaller subdivision of Taishan itself. Let's take Taishan as an example. The main city center of Taishan County is Taichung. This is also pronounced as Hoisan in Taishanese, if that might ring a bell to you. There are also other townships, such as Suibu, north of Hoisan. Some people may pronounce this as Suibo. I've heard that before. There's Onfun Ligyu or Leigyu, depending if you have the vowel shift. Elsan or Aosan and Hoian. Hoian is actually the birthplace of winter melon mooncakes, so that's pretty cool if you ever get the chance to visit Hoian. On the left here is a screenshot of a list of the text channels on the Taishanese server. We provide a list of townships with the Taishanese pronunciation and the Chinese characters if you ever need to sort of see how they're pronounced.
So you can imagine it must have been quite hard at the time for immigration officials to figure out how to spell all of these different place names using English. In my experience, it was common that they wouldn't even bother to write the village name down. Many immigration records only state the county, and here you have this just crazy list of all the different ways you could spell Sanhui or Xinhui County. But there is an additional difficulty, which is that place names and villages have changed so much in the last 150 years in China. Some villages have been completely renamed, others have been merged with others. Other villages have been moved and are now administered under a completely different town. So that would explain why, if you're lucky enough to find a village in Chinese characters and you type it into Google Maps, you might not get a result, because Google Maps only works with the modern place names. So really your goal when you try to locate your village is to try to find the modern address of your village. And I'm so glad somebody mentioned the Friends of Roots database earlier on in the chat, because that's by far like the best resource for Sze Yap villages. They have the surname filter, but the great thing about them is that they have historical place names. A lot of the structures that you see, the townships that are listed on this database, they would no longer be known under this quite the same name or in the same geographical structure, if that makes sense. So that's a great first step for first figuring out where it is. And then once you have a couple names of the upper towns or the upper hyung, I also don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the xiang, then thank you. Then you can try to play around with some other tools to figure out the modern day location. So for example, on the My China Roots Village database, we only store the modern place names at the moment. But if you know the town, let's say Baksa in Hoisan, that your family is from, you can then view all of the sub-villages that are inside that town and sort of narrow down your search. And that way you can get the full modern day address, which you could type into Google Maps, or even better would be the Chinese equivalent, Baidu Maps. Now, another reason why it's helpful to know the modern address is if you actually want to visit your village, you'll most likely want to make contact with somebody there. And some of us may no longer have relatives in Sze Yap. So in order to make contact with the village, unfortunately, it's unlikely that you'll be able to find a phone number online of your particular village in Sze Yap. So you would need to go through the government offices or perhaps contact a local clan association. For example, if you know that you are of the Li clan of Hoisan, then you could contact the Hoisan Li clan association and ask them to put you in touch with your village. But it's crucial that at that stage, you know your village contemporary address and you know your ancestor's full name in order for that to work. It's unfortunate with the current travel restrictions. I imagine most of you will have had to put your roots trips on hold. But in the meantime, our goal with this workshop was really to give you an overview of the different types of tools so that you know what to expect. If at any stage you get stuck or overwhelmed, our community is here to help. So thank you for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed our talk. We would love to know what other resources have been useful to you. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks so much, Edmond, Chloe, for guiding us through. There's so much to unpack here. So we just want to open up the floor for Q&A. What's coming up for you all in today's workshop? Feel free to type in the chat or come off of mute. We'd love to hear your voices. We have one about, is there a way to know how many immigrants were Hakka versus not?
It's kind of hard to measure. I don't think they were very strict when people left, and I'm sure that immigration officials wouldn't have known the difference at the time between Hakkas and non-Hakkas. But what's for certain is that some countries received many more Hakka populations than others. So case in point, the Caribbean, and also places like Peru has a huge Hakka population. And I mean, there are many more examples, but it would be mostly visible in the country of settlement, I would say.
I think also depending on the surname and like place of origin, there's certain areas that were much more Hakka, and there's certain ways that the Hakka pronunciation would spell a particular surname. So that would be a clue too.
For sure, yeah.
I just wanted to say that if you're searching for Hakka resources, the Hakka Discord server also has a dictionary bot with many types of different Hakka variants that you can search characters using. I can provide a link to that below as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks for sharing that resource.
So Suki asked, are all villages in Hoisan all one surname per village? I don't believe so. There are some that have multiple surnames. I think I recall seeing one in Suibu that had Fongs and Huis, for example. Fong and Hui. So you would have perhaps 2 surnames per village as well.
That's right. Sometimes even more. If you play around with the Friends of Roots database, you'll see when you get down to the village level, you can see some that have up to 4, 5, maybe even 6 different surname groups, depending on the area. A very handy thing to note about villages and how they were structured by surname is it was very common at the time for people to marry somebody from a neighboring village. So, for example, if you know that your great-grandfather's from one village in Toisan and you're not sure where your great-grandmother's from, you could look at the neighboring villages, and if any of them are of a majority surname that matches your great-grandmother's surname, and see if she might be from one of those villages.
I'm a little bit curious. I don't know if you want to share a little more on voice, Paula, but what's the story of the last Cuban Hakka man?
Oh, sure. A bunch of us went to Havana in 2017, I believe, to celebrate the anniversary of the Minchitang there. And in the bachelor's residences, the historic bachelor's residences, there was one born in China who still was alive and lived there. And we befriended him and spent some time talking with him over the next couple of days. But about a year later, he died. There is a woman in Havana, Mitzi Espinosa Luis, who is Hakka. There were not, to my understanding, a great number of Hakka people in Cuba because of the animosity that existed, of course, between the Hakka and the Bunti. So this one gentleman was one of about 25, as we understood, about 25 or so Hakka who went to Havana to work, and the rest of them passed. And is still researching the Hakka in Cuba.
Wow. Last one standing. Thanks for sharing some of that migration history.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear if there's any particular takeaway that you have from today, or something that you want to try looking for next based off of the workshop.
Oh, good question. Do you have to travel back to find your generation poem? Not necessarily. Some families know their generation poem. I mean, I've met some families, for example, in Southeast Asia who keep it. Maybe it's just on a bit of paper, but it's been handed down to them. And in some cases, if you know your clan and exactly where your village is, you might be able to find it online. There are some clans that have recorded all of the different generation poems in certain areas. And of course, if you find your zupu, zupus would also list generation poems by villages. So if you're lucky enough to find a digital copy of your zupu on one of the online offerings, whether it's My China Roots or the Family Search Genealogy collection, there could be a poem listed in there. But the first step to finding your poem would be mapping the names of each generation in your family. So starting with your father or your grandfather or whoever you think would have still adhered to the poem, because sometimes the practice was lost with time. And then comparing the characters in those names with characters that would be in available poems that you think match your family.
Sometimes online you can also find just someone wrote like an article about like the history of your specific clan, especially Taishanese ones, and they have the poem there. But if you get lucky, I guess.
Are there any resources to investigate Chinese families that traveled between China and the Philippines? So I'm not as familiar with Filipino records. I think those are typically a bit patchy, but I know that there are historical annals that were published on the Filipino Chinese community. Family searches a copy, but it's not online. I would say the best bet for tracing Filipino Chinese heritage is visiting the cemetery. If you are lucky enough to know where your family is buried, seeing if they have Chinese graves, and also looking into what are the Chinese associations in the area where your family was living in the Philippines.
Edmond, if you want to switch the slide to the last useful link slide. Yeah, the Discord links are there. Some of the search tools on the My China Roots website that we mentioned, and other databases like the Friends of Roots Villages, as well as archives that can be helpful, especially if you're in North America or Australia. At the bottom, you see reference for Zhang Clan Odyssey. That is a family website that we created for Raymond, who we met at the beginning, or we shared his 5-6 generation story at the beginning of the presentation. It's like a family website that maps out that whole journey across the ages in an interactive way.
If you're more interested in Taishanese-centric events, I recommend you check out the Taishanese Discord server. We do host some events from time to time, such as speaking practice or Kahoots or a small sort of information sessions to give you a taste of what the language is like.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And if you'd like to continue sticking around to chat, ask more questions, we'll be here for a few more minutes. It's really cool how curious and also deep, a lot of you are into your research and piecing together the different clues. So, jiayou to everybody.
Yes, good luck. There's often more than you would expect.
Sure.
Let us know what you find.
Genealogy research can take a long time, so it's important to have patience, have perseverance, but our hope is that this space can be supportive at whatever stage you're at. Thank you again, Chloe and Edmond.
Thank you. So glad that all of you folks joined us today.
Thank you for coming
Hope
out
you stick
today.
around.
Yeah.